morning, good afternoon, good evening, my bookworms, and welcome to another episode of Book Club Podcast. Guys, can you believe September starts next week? That means we only got 3 more months until 2021. My gosh, where does the time go? Well, I hope you guys are staying productive and motivated despite everything that's going on. And if not, maybe I can motivate you guys to start that one hobby or that one project that you always wanted to do by going over today's book. So I've been wondering recently what makes someone successful and what are the secrets behind the self-made billionaires. And apparently it's not necessarily intelligence or ambition, but it's something completely different. And we're going to dive into that in this episode. So today's book is Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And in this stunning book, he takes us on an intellectual journey through the world of outliers, the best and the brightest, the most famous and the most successful. And he asks the question, what makes high achievers different? And the short answer to that is that we pay too much attention to what successful people are like and too little attention to where they're from. That is their culture, their family, their generation, and the idiosyncratic experience of their upbringing. Along the way, the author will explain the secrets of software billionaires, what it takes to be a great hockey player, why Asians are good at math, and what made the Beatles the greatest rock band in the world. So stay tuned to find out the answer. So the book consists of many chapters and lengthy examples. Therefore, I chose a few that really stood up for me. And the first idea is that the month you were born in can determine how successful you're going to be. To put things into perspective, Gladwell describes Canadian hockey players' rise to the top of the sport in Canada. Roger Barnsley, a Canadian psychologist, looked at the 2007 roster for the Medicine Hat Tigers and the elite Canadian youth hockey team and noticed that an overwhelming number of players were born in January, February, or March. And conversely, there were very few players on the team born between October and December. The same pattern persisted elsewhere on other teams, and Gladwell gives us a sample explanation for this strange phenomenon. The cutoff for each class hockey is January 1st. That means the difference in strength and ability between someone who's almost 11 years old and someone who just turned 10 is significant. These bigger and older players make an impression on talent scouts at a young age, and then they're moved to better teams, receive better coaches, and have more opportunities to practice. And that is what makes them better. Similar trends are seen in some of the most popular youth sports in other countries, such as baseball in the US and soccer throughout Europe. All tend to feature players with birthdays right after the cutoff date on the best and most elite teams. So culturally dominant explanation for success that the best and the brightest rise to the top on their own merit don't account for things like arbitrary age cutoffs and the present opportunity. So your birthday relative to your peers may be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on the situation. Another example features research that shows children born toward the beginning of the calendar year tend to perform better academically than their younger peers born near the end of the year. So if you're older and more mature than your peers in the first grade and have developed skills that are easier the older you are, like reading, writing, your teachers will see you as smarter. And this age-based leveling system in schools creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Teachers will believe that older students are more intelligent, even if their advanced skills are due more to their development stage than to their superior intellect. Teachers believe smart students have more academic potential, giving them more attention and resources. This makes older kids truly academically superior to their peers. This example was really interesting to me as I was 5 years old when I started elementary school. And I actually remember starting school early was a thing back when I was a kid. Parents would bribe the school administration to have them enrolled when they're 5 years old because the minimum age to start elementary school back then was 6 years old. And therefore, all my classmates were either 6 or 7 years old. And I remember feeling a little bit behind on things at first. And my classmates seemed to have more exposure to a lot of random things. And they seemed to have had a head start in reading, writing, and just communicating with other kids in general. And I was actually a B student until 5th grade. But somehow after that, I started getting straight A's. So eventually I did catch up with my classmates, but my self-esteem took a big hit during that time, not understanding why I'm not performing as well as my classmates and why I wasn't a natural at making friends. I started becoming more reserved and less confident, and I wouldn't raise my hand even if I knew the material. But now I realize that I may have not been performing well because my classmates had a jump start in reading, socializing, and so on. So it is important to not rush your kids to start school, but to wait and have them join a class that has kids their own age, because this decision might impact how well they're going to do in school and their personality development. So now we're moving on to the second idea that I found really interesting. The author states that 10,000 hours of practice are required to achieve the level of mastery associated with being a world-class expert in anything. So let me tell you how the Beatles became to be the most successful and popular band in the history. So in 1960, the Beatles were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany. And at that time, Hamburg didn't have any rock and roll clubs. They had strip clubs. So the Beatles were seen performing by a club owner who asked them to come to play in Hamburg. And these clubs didn't pay well. The acoustics weren't right. And the audience didn't care much about what they were listening to. And what made this experience exceptional was the sheer length of time the bands were expected to play. So the sets were 8 hours long and they played 7 days a week. By the time the Beatles began having significant success in 1964, they had played live performances approximately 1,200 times, more than most bands to ever play live in their lifetimes, way more than 10,000 hours. So the 10,000 hours of practice was the making of them. But the other interesting thing about 10,000 hours, of course, is that it is an enormous amount of time and it's all but impossible to reach that number all by yourself. By the time you're a young adult, you have to have parents who encourage and support you. And you can't be poor because if you have to hold down a part-time job on the side to help make ends meet, there won't be time left in the day to practice enough. In fact, most people can reach that number only if they get into some kind of special program or get some sort of extraordinary opportunity that gives them a chance to put in those hours. Well, I don't think it's impossible to practice for 10,000 hours if you have a part-time job. It will just take you a bit longer. And I think 10,000 hours of practice will also help you understand if you're really passionate about that hobby or business. Because if you are, it won't seem too daunting since it's something you truly enjoy. So I think the idea here is that it's definitely a lot easier and faster for people who have the privilege of having all the time and resources to themselves. Some people even get lucky by getting that opportunity, such as the Beatles. And it also helps me feel better about my many failures at initial attempts to master things like skiing or sewing. And I realized that I won't get it right with a few tries, and I have to be consistent and put in a lot of hours if I want to be better, if not the best. So now we're moving on to the third idea that I found interesting, which is how you were brought up could impact your life significantly and how successful you're going to be. So the author talks about a story of Chris Langan and Robert Oppenheimer. So Chris Langan was a guy who grew up very poor, and his father was an alcoholic and for the most part absent, but he was a highly gifted student and he ended up getting a full scholarship to Reed University. And he was shy and reserved, and most of the time he didn't speak up, even though he knew the material. But one day he lost his scholarship because his mother failed to fill out a financial aid form correctly, and he had to drop out. He enrolled in Montana State University after working as a construction worker for a couple years, and he fared well there until one day his car broke down on the way to class, and he asked to be transferred to a different section so that he could avoid having absences. But his teacher and the whole administration was dismissive and didn't grant his request. So then he dropped out, deciding that he was done with the higher education system. And later on, he's written several papers on the origins of the universe, but no one will take him seriously since he didn't have a degree. And he saw institutions of higher learning as the preferred corporate entities interested in profit alone, so he didn't want to go back to school. And the author points out that though heartbreaking, Chris Langan's story is a little strange. He lost the scholarship because of one missed deadline on the financial aid form. And it seems every teacher and the whole school administration he met was utterly indifferent to him and all of his problems. He then moves on to Robert Oppenheimer's story, a famous physicist who led the American effort to develop a nuclear bomb in World War II. He was intellectual just like Langan from a young age, and he went to Cambridge to get his doctorate in physics, where his tutor forced him to study experimental physics, even though he preferred theoretical physics and believed everything else was below his intellect. He became unstable and tried to poison his tutor with chemicals from the lab, and for that Oppenheimer was only put on probation by the university, and later in life he was hired to lead the atomic bomb effort. So Langan was kicked out of school for forgetting to file a form, whereas Oppenheimer received probation for attempting to poison his tutor. So Langan believes he's a too controversial figure to be accepted by the Academy, where Oppenheimer was appointed to lead the development of a nuclear bomb in America during World War II, when he also had affiliations with the Communist Party. So we must conclude that Oppenheimer wouldn't have lost a scholarship at Reed. He wouldn't have taken no for an answer from professors or administrators. Oppenheimer knew how to get what he wanted from the world, and Chris Langan wasn't necessarily any less intelligent than Oppenheimer, but he lacked the kind of savvy that would have allowed him to succeed. The type of skill that enables a person to talk their way out of trouble or secure a job they're unqualified is called practical intelligence. Unlike IQ intelligence, which we believe people are born with, practical intelligence, on the other hand, is something a person wants to learn and practice. So sociologists have studied differences in parenting across racial, geographic, and economic lines. And one of the studies involved following individual children's parents around in their day-to-day lives and observing interactions. It was discovered that there are essentially only one primary dividing line concerning parenting style, which is class. So wealthier kids are encouraged, praised, and taught entitlement, and they learn to speak up if they're unhappy. They learn to customize their environment so that they can thrive. And poor children are better at being independent than wealthier children, but they receive less attention and praise. They learn to accept and cope with hardships instead of trying to change them. They learn from a young age that they're constrained, and they learn to accept this. And it just so happens that in today's world, a sense of entitlement makes you more suited to success than a sense of constraint. And this is probably where we can locate the most essential difference between Oppenheimer and Langan. Because Oppenheimer's parents were artists and successful businessmen, they fostered him with passion, made him join clubs, taught him skills like public speaking and negotiation, and they introduced him to higher powered people. Langan grew up in a bleak environment with parents who were mostly absent or too busy to help cultivate such skills. So this actually reminded me of my personal journey of applying to colleges. I moved to the US during my junior year in high school, and when I applied for colleges, pretty much all of them rejected me as my high school credits for history, science, and other classes didn't transfer from Mongolia, which is where I received my first 2 years of high school education. And my counselor was not very helpful with the process. She just called me up one day and just casually mentioned that I was not accepted to any of the colleges that I applied to. And I was distraught and confused because I thought I met all the requirements. So I decided to call up some of the universities and ask for more information myself. And it was a long process, and I was on hold for an eternity. But at the end of it, San Francisco State University offered me to take those classes during the summer before school starts. And I was accepted to that college. And if I didn't make that call, if I didn't stand up for myself, I don't know if I would have my bachelor's degree today. So I'm glad my parents taught me to freely express my opinions and to go after things myself. And they did enroll me in a lot of extracurricular activities in school and made me join clubs that I was more confident in, speaking up and freely expressing my opinions. So I know it's easier to accept things and stay quiet, but if we don't stand up for ourselves, who else will? So it was a good lesson for me, only to trust and depend on myself. And now I realize how important it is, how we were brought up, and what our parenting lifestyle were when we were young. So now we're moving on to the fourth idea that I really liked, which was the cultural legacy and social hierarchy and how that impacts how successful we're going to be. This chapter opens with the story of the crash of Korean Air Flight 801. The plane was in a good condition, the weather was bad, but not terrible, and as the captain and the first officer bring their aircraft to land, they can see the runway, so alarms began to go off as they get closer and closer to the ground. The flight engineer suggests that the captain pull up and try again. A short while later, he suggests this again, and this time, the captain agrees, but 3 seconds later, the plane slams into the side of a mountain, killing almost everyone aboard. So Korean Air had a spate of crashes in the 80s and the 90s that earned them a bad reputation and threatened their continued existence as an airline. Pilots who were founded by investigators to be undertrained and the proper safety protocol wasn't being followed. But amazingly, Korean Air has turned itself around since 1999. They have a perfect safety record, and it is now as safe as any airline in the world. The reason Korean Air succeeded was that they acknowledged the importance of its cultural legacy. Gladwell mentions that though plane crashes are often portrayed in the movies due to a single catastrophic event, in reality they occur because of the accumulation of many small problems. Lousy weather, tired pilots, new or unfamiliar airports, crew members who have only recently started working together, etc. And often it takes all of these things to add up to the disaster. Gladwell notes that when the first officer commented about the weather, he was trying to tell the captain that the weather conditions are dangerous. When he comments on how much he appreciates having weather radar in the cockpit, he suggests the captain to take a look at the radar. Korean culture is one in which the listener is expected to pick up on subtle cues like this, but the captain was tired and didn't hear what his first officer was trying to tell him. And this communication failure caused the plane crash in 2000, and Korean Air brought in experts to help them improve their communication in the cockpit. And they began to speak English, a language that didn't belong to their culture, and innocence allowed them to have a different kind of identity when talking. So this kind of reminds me of the Asian culture in general. Asian culture is usually very proper, formal, and sort of reserved at times, whereas the American culture is more outgoing and they start a conversation with strangers about anything. The American culture helps in a lot of things, like if you're trying to get a new job or make new friends. It's easier if you grow up in a culture that's more outgoing, where you can spark up a conversation with anyone. So overall, it is an interpersonal skill. It's a communication skill that people who grow up in the US learn from a young age. So it was definitely a big adjustment for me when I moved to the US from Asia. But by adapting to this culture and learning these interpersonal skills helped me tremendously in my social and academic life. And the last idea that I really liked from this book was where you come from geographically and culturally can also determine how successful you're going to be. So you're probably familiar with the stereotype that Asians are good at math. And some might cry that it's politically incorrect when they hear this. But several facets of Eastern culture do promote better math students. One is language. When children learn the words for numbers in Asian languages, they automatically know to add up numbers to develop their mathematical aptitude early on. And in addition to language, rice, which is the staple of the Asian diet, also helps students learn math because rice farming fosters an intense work ethic, and farming rice is much harder than farming Western crops. Feudal systems in Europe left farmers little to show from their work. They had to turn over most of their crops to ruthless landlords, but such systems were not prevalent in Asia. So rice farming offered a clear relationship between effort and reward. As a result, a culture of hard work developed. One particularly illuminating age-old saying was, "No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich." So what does this have to do with math? Well, like rice farming, math is hard. You might spend an hour trying to figure out why you keep getting negative 17 when the answer is supposed to be 2,500. Research has shown that students in Western countries give up on math problems far sooner than students in Eastern countries do. So yes, Asians are generally good at math. It's part of their cultural legacy. And people with ancestors who worked in rice paddies tend to inherit an attitude towards work that is particularly helpful when learning math. This tendency persists even generations after families have left rice paddies behind. So just an FYI, I actually didn't grow up in the Asian countries that does rice farming. So I'm not bad at math, but I'm not like super good at math. So I guess that explains why I wasn't just naturally good at math. All right, so these are the 5 points that really stood out to me. And to summarize those points, what month you were born in, how many hours you practice your hobby or passion, how you were brought up, your cultural legacy, and the geographic location of where you were born can all impact how successful you're going to be in life. So, like I mentioned, I didn't have time to go over all of the interesting examples in the book. So if you'd like to read the rest of the examples, you can click on the Audible link in the description box and get this book on Audible for free. Give it a try. Let me know how it goes. And that's it for today's episode. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.